Now, this video is about doing Gann angles, and in all the things I've read about Gann, I can't think of any books I've actually read that actually do Gann angles correctly. Now, that's a bit big-headed, but unfortunately it's true, and one of the biggest questions I get asked by people is what book would I recommend that people read to get started with Gann? And the answer I always give is I wouldn't recommend any of them because it's just frankly rubbish. Now obviously you need to know certain things about Gann angles, so what I'm going to do, I'll put a link here if I remember that you can click on, which you might have seen, but it explains a video I did back in early 2000 about what actually Gann said an angle was. It's incredibly, unbelievably simple, and yet nobody seems to do what he says. My apologies to people out there who do say the correct things, but if you've got software, for instance, that does something called a Gann fan, as I've mentioned many times, it has nothing whatsoever to do with what Gann said. And there's another way that people do Gann angles, and which we're going to be discussing today. Now, somebody contacted me the other day and said he was going to read a certain book before he took what I was offering any further. So I thought I'd get the book and just have a look at it and see what it said. And I just looked at the first example and I just thought, what a complete and utter even the examples given don't work. Okay, now we're going to compare the first example. I didn't bother reading the rest of the book because I didn't think there was much point, but we're going to take the first example in the book and then I'm going to show you how to do it correctly at the end. Now the first example is taken from this book. It looks like it was done in maybe 1990, something like that. And the first example looks like this. Now the first thing I tried to do with this example in the book was to try and reproduce what he'd actually done. And I just couldn't get anything that looked anything like it. So then I spent quite a bit of time trying to work out what he'd actually done. Now first of all, the first thing I noticed was that he's moved the decimal place 2 places to the right. So this is back in about 1987, just after the 87 crash I believe. So what he's done is he's moved the decimal place 2 places to the right. There is nowhere in any of Gann's writing anywhere that says you should do that. In fact, by actually doing that, you're destroying the whole concept of what Gann was trying to achieve. Now if you look very closely at the chart, it's showing you that we have a 1 by 1 angle here, a 2 by 1 angle going up here, and a 4 by 1 angle going up here. So okay, so I thought I'd try and reproduce that. So here's the chart, and I've moved the decimal place 2 places to the right, as you can see on the scale here. In his example, I think he was using the futures contract. Unfortunately, I don't have the futures contract going back quite that far, so I'm going to have to use the cash contract. So this is the cash price. Now, if you read anything that Gann said, it basically said that his most important angle is a 1 by 1. Now what that actually means is it's an angle that goes up at the rate of 1 unit of price per 1 unit of time. So this is a daily chart, so each line represents a day. So it would be an angle that goes across 1 day and goes up 1 unit of price. But as I've already mentioned, he's changed the unit of price by moving the decimal place. But let's do what he did. First of all, let's look at his chart again. So you can see that the 1 by 1 is a bit flatter than roughly 45 degrees. The 2 by 1 looks more like 45 degrees in the example that we've got here. So let's put on a 1 by 1. So this is an angle that goes up at the rate of 1 penny every day. Now straight away you can see that it's an incredibly flat line, and the reason it's an incredibly flat line is because he's moved the decimal place 2 places to the right. Now the next angle would be a 2 by 1 according to Gann. The next one would be a 4 by 1. The next one would be an 8 by 1. So all you do is you double the last number to get the next one in the series, and in fact 16 is probably the last one that Gann actually talks about. So that's where the angle should be if you've moved the decimal place 2 places to the right, which I've already mentioned you should never do. So it's nothing like the chart that we've got here. They're in completely and utterly different positions. Now I think it's also worth pointing out here, if you actually look at these angles, which it took me quite a bit of time to work out what was happening, but it just doesn't work. If you actually look at what happens, so if we ignore the ones coming down here, when it reached the 4x1, which is roughly about here, the price just went straight through it. When it did get to the next one, which is a 2x1, it went through it. I mean, you could draw random lines and get things to do that. So the example doesn't work. But what he's trying to show is that if you draw these angles where they cross, they give turning points in the market. But basically just picking a few times when it works, and it doesn't really actually work if you actually look at the days that the actual market actually does change. So it's not a particularly fantastic example. It does give you that high there. It does, you could say, give you this low here, but this one here gives you the day before the actual bottom. Okay, and then he's missed out this one here, and he's missed out this one here, and he's missed out this one, which obviously you can't show because it's happening to the future. Anyway, so then I tried to work out what's actually happening, and the first thing I did is I noticed these dots, and I didn't particularly know what they were. Now this is a bit of a different size. I've had to reduce the size to fit it in the area you've got, but if you actually look at the original, which is the PDF file, the distance actually from that low there to the second dot, if you measure it with a ruler, is exactly an inch. Now Gann spent lots of time talking about formatting charts the right way to draw the angles correctly. Now the first thing you've got to realise is that when Gann was around there was no such thing as computers, and all charts had to be drawn by hand. So to make all that a lot easier, it's very easy, it's much better if you try and scale the charts correctly. So for example, as I said before, watch the video I've done, which is that explains what a Gann angle is according to Gann. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go roughly over what I said in there, but I'll go into more depth in the video on YouTube. Now if we put some graph paper on, Gann spent a lot of time explaining how to set your charts up so that you could actually draw them correctly. Now I wrote a long time into my charting software to always have the graph paper looking square, but I format it in a certain way. Each line going upwards represents a day, and each line going up here, each tick, represents a penny in this particular case. So if I go to say this low here, and I'll put a circle there, Gann said his most important angle is an angle that goes up at the rate of 1 penny every day. So if you just did one tick, it'd be very difficult to draw that angle very closely. So what we've got, if I count across 10 days, so there's 10 squares to here, and I go up 10 pence, so we've gone from 100 to 110, then you can see that the angle goes exactly through that point there. So if I did have a dot there, I could draw a line through there, and I would get an angle that goes up at the rate of 1 penny per day. And because of the way it's scaled and the spacing, it looks like 45 degrees. And Gann said it was his most important angle. But as I show you in the basic angle video, 45 degrees has absolutely nothing to do with why it works. Okay, but everybody keeps getting caught up on this daft idea of 45 degrees just because Gann mentioned that the 1x1 represents 45 degrees. Okay, but just get your head out of the fact it's a 45 degree angle. The next angle Gann said you could draw is a 2x1, so that's one that goes up 2 units of price per 1 unit of time. So if we look at this as bigger squares, as it goes across 10 days, and to draw a 2x1 it would go up 20 pence. So we go from 100, which is the low, to 120, which would bring us out here. To draw the angle below the 1x1, it would be one that goes up at the rate of 1 penny every 2 days. If I did it from the right place, from there. You can see that if we go across 2 big squares, because it's easier to see, and go up 1 square, you can see it's exactly where it goes through the intersection on the graph paper that's done there. Now the problem occurs when we change the scale. So at the moment I'm going up at the rate of 10, but I could change that to 20, and straight away you can see that the chart changes. All the angles have got flatter. Okay, it's hard to see now, but that there is a 1 by 1, sorry, 1 by 2. The 1 by 1 no longer looks like 45 degrees, but it's still 45 degrees. It's got nothing to do with the fact that you have to have your graph paper scaled in a certain way. As I said, Gann had to do that because it was very difficult to draw charts, and it was much easier to do it if you set up your chart in the right way in the first place. The problem gets a bit more acute. At the moment that's going up at 20 points per big tick, so we go from 120 to 140. But if I change it to some weird number like 37 per distance between there and there, then we get flatter and it gets a bit more difficult. But the angles are still the same angles and the prices would still be in exactly the same place. Okay, but people have got fixated on this idea that it has to be a 45-degree line. And that's basically what's happening here. Okay, now it doesn't actually explain how the angles worked out in the book, and like I said, I've had to try and work out what's going on. So, like I said, mine's the cash chart, this one's the actual futures chart, so it's going to be slightly different. But I found this document on the website which explains basically what's trying to be achieved. So I'll let you read it at your own leisure. So hopefully you can see the web address there, and basically it talks about an automated 1 by 1 Gann angle, or a 45-degree angle. Now I'll let you read what it goes and says, and it starts off pretty well. It explains the problem, but unfortunately it then comes up representing a 45-degree angle based on the scale that you're actually looking at it on your computer. But the first part of it explains the problem, which is good, so I'll let you read all that. And then down here there's a bit in his software that basically allows you to extend the multiplier and the slope. This is where it just alters completely what Gann was trying to achieve. It is, and unfortunately most software packages are actually written by programmers who usually don't know much about the actual subject, but this guy obviously does because he understands what Gann was trying to achieve. But by doing this and trying to simulate a 45-degree line on a chart, no matter what the scale is, okay, just changes it completely to what Gann was trying to say. So like I said, read it, but just realise that what you're reading is. So I got a little bit off track there. So basically what I found was this, that the distance from there to there, if measured, is actually exactly an inch. And you can see that the 1 by 1 line goes through a dot going up there. So it's obviously going to cross 1 inch by 1 dot up. So it seemed to me that 2 of these represents 1 up to get that 45-degree line. And it's kind of squared off to try and get it to look like a 45-degree angle. So basically what it actually is if you actually count how many days it is to the first dot from the low, it's 1, 2, 3, if you include the one you're on, 1, 2, 3, 4, so it's 5 days, okay, to the first dot. And what it turns out is that half an inch represents 5 days, so 10 days would represent an inch going this way, and then it's actually multiples of 10 going this way, so it's a 10 by 10, okay, to draw this 1 by 1. So let's go to my software and stick that on. So let's reproduce this here. So we've got the low that he was using in December, and his chart finishes, I think, is about here in February, so he doesn't have this fall here. So what we're going to do is we've got to go, what he's doing is going across 10 days from the low, and then going up units of 10 going this way, and as I already said, that's got nothing to do with what Gann said. But so in other words, if it goes up a 10 by 10, you'd look like that, which is the same as a 1 by 1 because both 10 and 10 can divide into each other. So that actually would be a Gann angle, apart from the fact that it's moved the decimal place 2 places to the right. So it's not actually right. Now if we multiply the 10 by 2, we get 20. If you multiply, it's still 2 flat. If you multiply 20 by 2, you get 40, which would be 2 flat. If you multiply that by 2, you get 80, by 10, which would be 2 flat. If you multiply that, you get 160 by 10. If you multiply that by 2, you get 320 by 10. If you multiply that by 2, you get 640 by 10. If you multiply that by 2, you get 1280 by 10, and that basically reproduces what he did. But remember again that this is the cash chart, not the futures chart, so there's going to be a slight difference. And you'll see, if we look at this angle here, which is a 640 by 10, then you can see that it breaks it by quite a bit. And if we look at the chart here, when he got to what he calls a 2 by 1, then you can see that it actually gets broken by about the same distance. On my chart, that low there actually touches the 4 by 1 that it's got on here. But hopefully you can see that it isn't actually anything to do with a 1 by 1. In fact, there's no relationship whatsoever to 4 by 1s, and as I've already mentioned, it doesn't work. I mean, you could kind of say that this one works, okay, but that doesn't work. Okay, when it got there, you know, you're looking to buy it, it breaks it by a bit, that puts you off. The next day it probably hits your stop loss, and then it goes up. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. It's always easy looking at things after the event, and it always amazes me how, when you're looking at examples about Gann, how their examples just don't work, and yet people read it and actually think they know what they're talking about. But for me, that doesn't work, and when we compare it a bit later on, you'll see that it works incredibly well if you do what Gann went and said. In fact, it works perfectly into the future. Okay, so in effect, you could actually knock the noughts off both of those. So you could say that was a 16 by 1, a 32 by 1, a 64 by 1, and a 128 by 1, which actually would be what Gann would actually kind of do. He'd go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. Okay. Now, I don't want to use this with a decimal place in the wrong place, because we're going to be wrong before we even start. So I'm going to change the chart to the one with a decimal place in the right place. Okay, so what we've done now is I've put the decimal place in the correct place. Now, to reproduce the same angles that he's done, in effect, what you've got to do is you've got to put 100 in the day box, which effectively moves the decimal place 2 places to the right. So if I do a 1 by 100, it's a very flat line. If you multiply the 1 by 1, you get 2, multiply the 2 by 2, you get 4, then you get 8, then you get 16. And so if we do a 16 by 100, the next one 32 by 100, next one 64 by 100, next one is 128 by 1. So these numbers are the same, 32, 64, 128, but they're in slightly different places, and I've moved the decimal place to, you can see it's 100 to actually do what he actually produced on his physical chart. But you can see it's got no relationship whatsoever to a 1 by 1, a 2 by 1, and a 4 by 1. It's only by doing that strange calculation, which you can look at the web page, which will actually show you. Now hopefully you can't hear the rain, which has just started to lash it down. Now also, I think he's being a bit misleading about looking at this particular part of the chart. If you look at it, he's taken this low in December of 1987, and the way as you look at the chart, it looks as if that's a major low, and that's why he's using that particular low, but actually is not. This isn't the major low. This is just after the 1987 crash. Now, he does actually mention that it's just after the 1987 crash, but this big fall here, yeah, this is the major low. Now, it's very easy to pick a chart and just to go and show you, you know, just to show you something that happens to work with the benefit of hindsight, even though, in my personal opinion, this doesn't work anyway. Okay, so really, most people who do Gann would actually be using the major low in September. However, I actually do agree with him. I actually think this is the major low you should be using anyway. But I don't think he's doing it for that reason. He's just doing it because it fits what he wants to show. So the question is, does this series of numbers work into the future, which is obviously what this is all about. So let's look at that. So this is basically where he left his chart. So we've got the angles on. That was a 4x1 according to him, that's a 2x1, and that's a 1x1, and obviously the one below that one he would have had on would be a 1x2, which in my case is going to be emulated by a 16x100 to do the same thing due to the decimal place, etc., and the strange way that they've calculated the angles. Now if we go forward, I should mention by the way that when you actually calculate the angle based on 45 degrees based on the price scale, the angle will change. So if you took the 87 crash into consideration and did the same calculation that's actually mentioned on the web page, then all these angles will move completely, which of course is nothing to do with what Gann went and said. So let's see what happens. So we go forward in time, and so the next major one is this one here, which he said was a 1x1, which of course it isn't, but let's see what happens when it gets there. So when it gets there, eventually, we've got to it, it slows down, shows a bit of resistance, so you might buy, and then you lose your money. And then, in other words, they're just basically random lines, and have got nothing to do with what Gann went and said. I won't go any further. You can see, hopefully, that it doesn't actually work. Okay, so does it actually work from a Gann point of view? Well, first of all, you can't do what Gann literally said because it won't work. So let's first of all do what Gann actually literally said if you read his courses. He said, okay, so the decimal place is now in the correct place. So he said his most important angle is one that goes up at the rate of 1 penny every day. Now, score. So if we actually do that, you can see because the scale's now in a better position and it's not being moved 2 places to the right, it's more like 45 degrees, but that just happens to be the way it's scaled. Remember, 45 degrees is a massive red herring. It's got nothing to do with it whatsoever. But that would be a 1x1 if you do what Gann literally said. In other words, in this particular case, it's an angle that goes up at a rate of 1 penny every day. The next one he said would to draw below the 1x1 will be one that goes up at the rate of 1 penny every 2 days. And let's see what happens when it gets there. It doesn't work. And the next one would be one that goes up at the rate of 1 penny every 4 days. And basically, if we go into the future, it kind of works, but it broke it by a bit, and you'll see in a minute that when this does work, it works incredibly well. So what we've done here is you've done what Gann literally said you did. Personally, when I said I would use the same low, what I should have said was I would actually use the 1987 crash low for these lows here, and the only ones I could carry on drawing once they fell below here, okay, will be the ones that are flatter. So if I do a 1x8, for instance, that one I could draw from the lowest point, yeah, but I couldn't do the 1x4 because it got broken. So personally, I would cut the line. So all this stuff here, I would cut the line when the price got broken through. If you don't, it all gets incredibly complicated, and in fact doesn't help you at all anyway. But as I said before, that's completely wrong, even though that one doesn't look too bad. So you need to know where to draw angles from, where not to draw angles. It's a massive subject, and most of it Gann didn't write down. It's mostly what I've discovered myself. Okay, now if you, I'll put a link here as well if I think on, which this will be a link to the angle videos. So you think you're doing Gann Angles that I did on the S&P over the last 4 or 5 years, and pretty much I found all the tops of the market without the benefit of hindsight, which of course is what most people use. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the master time factor to the same master time factor that I did in the video, so you think you're doing Gann Angles part 1 to part 5. Okay, so I'm going to take these off because that isn't right, even though Gann said that's what you should do. So let's go to this low here, and I've now got the correct master time factor stuck in. And if I do a 1x1, you can see that it's a flat line, whereas when I showed you the chart before and did a 1x1 with a different master time factor, you can see there's in a completely different place. That's what Gann would do, that's what I would do. So let's change it back. Next angle Gann said you should draw is a 2x1. The next one is a 4x1. Now, as I said, those angles I actually wouldn't have on from this low. So from this low here, I would have, let's just see where 2x1 is, two flats, 4. The 4 I would still draw from the secondary low because it did break that level there by a little bit, but if you do a 3x1, which is halfway between a 2 and a 1, that's the one that I'm looking for. So this 3x1 is actually drawn from the lowest point, and the 4x1 I wouldn't draw from there, I would actually draw from this low here. But because the 2x1 from this low is lower than the 1x1 from this low, I would take off that, and I would take off that, and I would draw the flatter angles from the lowest point. So we've got a 4x1 on, an 8x1. Now these angles basically I can draw before the market ever gets there. So let's just scroll back a little bit. So I've just moved it back to how the chart looked on the example that we're comparing it against. So a 4x1 is just a set geometric line. An 8x1 would be there. A 16x1 would be there. Now I didn't fit this in with this low here, as most people do with trend lines, which is just total hindsight as far as I'm concerned. When it touched the 16x1, it's where the market went and turned. Okay? It's a set geometric line. It's got nothing to do with 45 degrees. The next one is an 8x1, and the next one is a 4x1. So let's scroll forward and see what actually happens on those angles in the future. Now, it actually stopped on the 8x1 exactly. Okay, but it only went up for 3 days and then came down. So there's a difference between being right and making money. What makes you money is not being right, it's how long you're right for. Because as some of the videos have shown you, the secret to making money is making big profits and small losses. So personally, if I would have made the trade on the 8x1, then basically I'd have a stop loss below that level, so if it went through, I'd take a small loss. Notice how I've cut the angle because I'm no longer interested once it goes through. Now there are other angles that I've discovered that Gann didn't talk about. Now it might sound pretty simple what I'm about to show you, but it took 15 years maybe of research trying to prove if I was right or not. Which of course the person who wrote the book probably never did. But that's a 16x1 and that's an 8x1. What's halfway between the two? A 12. The exact bottom to give you that level there was exactly on a 12x1. What's half of 12? 6. Halfway between 8 and 4 is 6. Now I'm not picking this example because it's a great example, I'm just picking it because I'm just doing what he did in the book and just showing you that what he's doing is just wrong. Now by the way, I would never trade this angle in the future. I never trade trend lines. Trend lines are the biggest mistake you can trade on. Sometimes they work, but the vast majority of times they don't. What tends to happen if they work is they work just long enough to get you into the trade and then come down and break you through. Or as the old saying goes, what everybody knows isn't worth knowing. So I would make that a weak line, which just means a light line, which just tells me that if I can't see the low in 1987, so for instance the chart looks like this, I don't need to go back and see that that's a trend line because that shows me that it is. Now this 6x1 I put on before the market ever got there and it worked. It's the exact bottom, exactly where the market found its low and went up for 4 or 5 days. Okay, so in this particular case if I would have traded it I probably would have ended up breaking even. Okay, but you can see that it's working pretty much exactly to give you the exact turning points in the market. So the next angle we have is the 4x1, so let's go and see what happens when it gets there. Now I don't know when it's going to get there until it actually gets there, but you drew the angle before it got there. Now people also get fixated on saying they've got to predict the date and time that something's going to happen in the future. Well, I think I'm pretty good at this and I can't do that. I can't say that something will happen on a certain day in the future, but then I realised over time, what's the point? I'm only going to make the trade when it gets, or make the decision to make the trade when it gets there, so why try and predict it? I'll see it when it gets there, which is the same as saying you know, it's got there. So let's see what happens. It doesn't quite reach it, so I haven't quite done it. Market goes up, then it comes down. It comes shooting down very quickly, which if you were in the trade because you did it before it got there, that would have probably scared you half to death. You would have got out, especially if you were daft enough to watch intraday prices. And then the market goes up, and it happens to be the bottom of the market. Okay, if you really think about what you're seeing here, it shows you that the future is predictable. But like I said, it's not predictable in it will happen on a certain day. It's more like it's attracted to something and it will get there how it wants to get there. Now you're going to say, well, why did the market bottom out here? Well, it's pretty simple. That's a 6x1. That's a 4x1. Well, what's halfway between 6 and 4? It's 5. And as you can see, the exact bottom was made in a 5. I wouldn't be interested the second time because now it's a trend line. Anybody who's got a ruler will draw a line from the low through this point here and will be looking to buy it here. But here it wasn't a trend line. Here it was just a mathematical point in the future. So don't trade trend lines. That's why I'm not interested the second time in the examples that I've just gone and shown you. Now I was trying to think of a way of proving that the master time factor is exactly the same master time factor that I was using in the video I put on So You Think You're Doing Gann Angles Part 4, which is actually the same master time factor in all the other previous versions and the one after that. And so I thought I'd show you a frame of that actual video. Now this low here is the low in what is it, October 2011. And then I show you here, this is a 24x1 angle, and it goes through the low in June of 2012. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that on the chart that we've been looking at, and then I'm going to move that angle and show you that they're the same thing. So bear with me a second. So this is the S&P with the same low, so that's the October 2011 low, and on that previous frame you could see that it went through this low in June of 2012, and it's a 24x1. Now it's a 12x1, that's a 16x1. What else did I have on that previous chart? We had an 8x1. Okay, so in fact that there is a 3x1 from the 87 crash low, which happens to be where that low is, by the way, but I'll get rid of that. It's going to get confusing. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to so basically what you're going to remember is that from there to there goes through that low there, and I'm going to change it to a weekly chart. And that 24x1 there, from that low there, which is the one we're using, on the weekly chart, goes through exactly the same position. Now what I can do is I can move that around, and you can see the same, that angle there stays the same. So if I move it back to that low that was made there, you can see it's still the same. It's a bit easier if I just move it a little bit. So in other words, the angle's staying in the same position relative to the prices no matter what happens. So what I can do is if I move those around, it's going to be a bit easier to change it to a monthly chart, and I'm going to go down to the bit that we're doing. So you can see this, the steepness is the same. That's the 24x1 on the monthly chart. That's the lows. You can see it's still in the same position, the 24x1, so it's not changed relative to the prices. And this low here was the bit that we're doing before, so I'll just change it to a daily chart. In 1988ish. So those are the same angles. I just moved it around, so I can move it say to here, it's in the same position, and I can move it to close to that low there, and if I move those angles, which I'm just going to make weak lines so you can see it a bit clearer. Now, so I've got a 12x1 and I think on this one I've got a 12 by 1. So from this low here I've got a 12 by 1. So this 12 by 1 from this random place here should overlap the 12 by 1 I've done from here if these angles are the same. That 8 by 1 here should be the same as this 8 by 1 drawn from here. So if I move it to the low that was made there, you should be able to see that the 12 by 1 is in exactly the same position as the video that I did a couple of years ago, and the 8 by 1 is in the same position as the 8 by 1 that I've done there, just basically proving that they are the same angles. You can see the 16 by 1 is the same as the 16 by 1 I did on the video from there, so it proves that I'm using exactly the same master time factor on an example that was done by someone completely different back in 1987. Okay, and hopefully you can see that we've taken the techniques of W.D. Gann way past basically what Gann said, but it is what Gann said. Okay, it was either didn't know it himself, or he kind of hits the wrong word. It's blatantly obvious, but hopefully you enjoyed it, and that's why I don't recommend books on Gann, because the vast majority of it is just spouting off what Gann said without any concept of what it's really all about. So I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want more information you can contact me at Gary with one R in at gann.co.uk. Website's www.gann.co.uk, and we hold free introductory webinars once a month, which you can find on the website. So thanks for taking the time to listen, and I hope you found it useful.